Let me, to do what Don instructed me to do, let me tell you a little bit about the Oregon Property Owners Association. We are the state's, as our name indicates, we are the state's Property Owners Association. Farmers, realtors, ranchers, developers, from the husband and wife with the 5,000 square foot lot in the middle of Portland to the rancher with 50,000 acres in Harney County. Our job is to defend your rights to own and use your property, which in Oregon is a somewhat difficult job. I am a land use attorney by training, and I spend the bulk of my time in the even-numbered years, in the odd-numbered years at the Marble Nut House in Salem, advocating on behalf of property owners across the state, which we just finished our long session at the end of June. I think my PTSD has finally subsided from that. I spent most of August out at Buoy 10 catching salmon, and when the ocean was, the bar was good enough, we'd go all the way out and catch tuna. If you've never been tuna fishing and you like fishing, I highly recommend it. So anyway, I am recovering from the last session in Salem, which was somewhat difficult, and gearing up for the next one that starts in February. So let's get into our topic, Wetlands 101, or as I refer to it, you call that a wetland, are you kidding me? This is a topic of increased importance, especially in the Willamette Valley, and especially for the cities in the Willamette Valley. It is having you are going to hear more about wetlands as you go along, and so let's get into it now. The goal of this presentation, well, we've really got three goals. We're going to do an overview, sort of a 40,000 foot level look at wetlands issues, and there's three reasons that we're going to do that. Number one, none of you in here need to be a wetland expert, but you should certainly know when to recognize that you might need one. The same thing goes with land use. You don't have to be land use experts. You don't have to know every section of the Benton County zoning ordinance, but you do need to understand that, this might be a question, and I should recognize that it might be a question, and I might need to know who I need to call or where I need to go to get an answer to that question. So it's the same with wetlands. I'm not going to ask you, we're not going to go out there and identify wetlands, but you at least need to know when you might run into one, and what you need to do in order to determine whether you've got a problem. Number two, we don't have time to dive into the weeds. This wetlands issues, as we'll get into, are regulated at the federal level, they're regulated at the state level, they're regulated at the local level, and if we really wanted to do a thorough deep dive into wetlands, we'd be here every week for probably 6 months, going through all the various wetlands regulations, and obviously we don't have time to do that. And number three, I'm not a wetlands consultant. A lot of these issues you are going to end up relying, if you're a developer, property owner, realtor, you're going to need to rely, even a farmer, you're going to need to rely on a wetlands consultant to make the delineation and determination, and I am not one. And so for those reasons, we're doing more of a 40,000 square foot look at wetlands as opposed to the deep dive. So what we're going to do is we're going to cover basics, we'll increase your awareness, I hope, and we'll give you some directions on where you can go for help. Okay, what is a wetland? Well, does that look like a wetland to you? It sure does to me. I think we can all agree in the room that something that looks like this is probably a wetland. You can tell it's inundated with water. It's right next to a major water body. You're not going to develop that into a 240 lot subdivision. That is a wetland. So how about this? Well, yeah, that looks like what if you conjure up in your mind a picture of a wetland, yeah, that probably qualifies. You can see the, is that a crane or a heron? Whatever that is in there is there, and it's wet, and that's a wetland, sure. Now we get into the really. See that? That's some Willamette Valley property, and down there, I don't know if you can see, I don't think my pointer reaches that far, but you can see right in the center of the picture, if you look down in the dirt about 3 or 4 feet, you can see an old clay drain tile. That is property that was tiled. They haven't used clay drain tiles for quite some time. That's property that was probably tiled by a farmer in the 40s, 50s maybe, and has been farmed ever since. You don't see anything remotely looking like that on that, but unfortunately the Oregon Department of State Lands calls that entire property a wetland. And then we get to what the hell, and that's that, okay? That's also Willamette Valley property. That's inside the urban growth boundary, that's zoned for multifamily development, that's flat, and it looks like there's been a little bit of farm work on there, but not significant. That entire area that you can see in that picture has been deemed as to be wetlands by the Department of State Lands. So we look at the definition of wetlands in 196-800 sub 17. ORS stands for the Oregon Revised Statutes. Those are the statutes made by the legislature. Those are the laws of the state of Oregon. And there's a wetlands definition in 196-800 sub 17, as you can see there. Wetlands means those areas that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, and that under normal circumstances do support, a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. So if you're someone like me that's representing someone that's trying to do a development project and you have to do an individual delineation because the city is demanding that, and that's the definition you're working with, that's not, that's a pretty broad definition, and it's subject to quite a few words that can be interpreted in quite a few different ways by whoever it is that's making the ultimate determination of whether or not you have a wetland. That's a long way of telling you that whether or not you have a wetland is capable of being viewed quite differently from multiple different people, including the folks at DSL or the Corps or your local government. In fact, you may have three different determinations, one from the Corps, one from DSL, and one from the local government, reaching three different conclusions about whether or not the particular area is a wetland, and if it is a wetland, how big the wetland area is. So here's what we're supposed to look for when we determine. The key indicator is hydric soils. Okay, and that's the definition of hydric soils. It's essentially soils that at the top level of the soil develop anaerobic conditions, and that could be from a high groundwater table, or that could be because the soils are clay and water just pools on top of them. The problem and the key for you and for all of us is that hydric soils are prevalent in the Willamette Valley. And that's becoming clear as DSL, the Department of State Lands, conducts its statewide wetlands inventory and starts to roll out its maps for its statewide wetland inventory, and we're finding areas that no one thought were a wetland that DSL considers a wetland, and we're having sort of and this is why this is going to become a bigger issue, we're having sort of an oh my God moment in a number of cities in the valley that said, well, that's that area there is my entire buildable lands inventory for my city, and now DSL says the bulk of it is hydric soils and then hence a wetland indicator. Well, yeah, problem. The other thing that DSL looks for is wetland vegetation. The Corps, the Corps is the Army Corps of Engineers federal agency. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers maintains a list of indicator plant species that all of I believe, the federal government uses, and I believe most state jurisdictions use as well. And it's a very detailed, thick list of the various plant species for each one of the various regions of the United States. And if you look through that indicator, when they're out doing a delineation, on the ground delineation, they'll look for these types of plant species. And if you have plant species growing or evidence of those particular types of plant species, there are some that grow in wetlands only, there are some that grow on uplands only, and there are some that, like blackberries, Himalayan blackberries, that can be present anywhere. I think Himalayan blackberries can be present in the Mariana Trench, but at least at my house, I spend a fair amount of time killing stupid Himalayan blackberries. But anyway, they are a species that is present in both wetlands and in uplands, and so it's not a real good indicator. The point is, the government body is going to be looking for hydric soils and wetlands vegetation to determine whether or not you have a wetland. So why should we care about this? What difference does it really make? Well, there's both positive reasons to care and negatives reasons to care, and we'll start with the positives. Wetlands provide, and there's no doubt about this, wetlands provide very significant wildlife habitat and protection. There are all kinds of bird species that use wetlands, amphibians, they're salmon-bearing, they have salmon-bearing capabilities. And so wetlands are very important for purposes of wildlife habitat, and there's no doubting that or denying that. They also act as a very good filter to ensure that we have clean water, and they'll filter out some of the pollutants that come from the various sources that fill the wetlands, and they serve an important role as far as cleaning the water and pollution control. And then, of course, water storage and flood reduction. If we go in with a bulldozer and fill in a wetland and pave it, then all of a sudden that land that was acted as a sink, all of a sudden is an area, a source of runoff, and that water has to find somewhere else to settle. And so wetlands certainly serve as important water storage areas. So why should we care about wetlands? The negatives, number one, and we're seeing this really clearly in the last couple of years. Wetlands regulations create a significant conflict with Oregon land use law. So we have, and I've had folks from the various agencies, both DLCD, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, the state land use agency, with folks from DSL saying, well, wait a minute, your mission DSL is to protect wetlands. Your mission, DLCD, is to encourage, multiple missions, but saving farmland, saving forest land, encouraging compact urban form, allowing development inside urban growth boundaries. We're having a hard time, especially in the smaller valley cities, doing the compact urban development that you want, while this agency is telling us that we can't do the compact urban development you want because all of your buildable land inventory is composed of hydric soils with wetland indicator species and hence is wetland. So what are we supposed to do? And they look at each other and shrug their shoulders and say, I don't know. But the point is, as we have growth in the valley, and we've had growth steadily for the last 30 years, as we have growth in the valley, we're starting to run into some real conflicts between wetlands regulations and land use regulations. They also have significant impacts on development, affordability, and the economy. We'll get into a case study out of the city of Sheridan with an affordable housing project that is being stymied by wetlands regulations as we go further. But just understand that, and the legislature is recognizing that we're having increasing conflicts, and we need to do something about it. So who regulates wetlands in Oregon? The short answer is everyone. We have the federal government, the USACE, that stands for the United States Army Corps of Engineers. The Corps is the permitting agency for wetlands fill permits at the federal level. Also the EPA, that's the United States Environmental Protection Agency. They have oversight over the Corps and have the ability to review Corps permits and essentially overturn those Corps permits. So the main agency at the federal level you'll be dealing with is the Corps, not EPA, but on a controversial project, EPA can come in and override the Corps. At the state government level, we have DSL and DLCD. DSL stands for the Department of State Lands. That's the main wetland permitting agency in Oregon. They're obviously based out of Salem. And DLCD is the Department of Land Conservation and Development. They're the land use planning agency in Oregon, and they regulate wetlands through statewide Planning Goal 5. And then at the local government, we have the local government implementing statewide Planning Goal 5 through their land use planning program. One of the Goal 5, so you know, is the LCDC's natural resources goal. Wetlands, wildlife habitat, scenic views, open spaces, historic resources, and the like are all regulated by Goal 5, and every city and county in Oregon is required as part of its comprehensive plan to comply with Goal 5. So every city and county has the ability to regulate wetlands via Goal 5, and they'll do that through their local zoning ordinance and comprehensive plan. Now, the nice thing about Goal 5, it's one of the few, if not the only goal that allows cities a fair amount of flexibility. Corvallis, for example, could go in and do a Goal 5 wetland inventory and say, okay, here's the areas within the city that we are designating as significant Goal 5 wetlands resources. But once they do that, the choice as to whether or not to allow development in those areas, either partially, wholly, or not at all, rests entirely with the city of Corvallis. And that's rare in land use planning in Oregon. Most local governments are stuck with mandates that the state makes, and so here we have a little bit of flexibility on that, but they're regulated through Goal 5 and their LWI. The LWI stands for a local wetlands inventory. Each city and county in Oregon has the ability to create a local wetlands inventory if they want to. There are not that many jurisdictions that have them. They work with DSL to do them. They're expensive and time consuming, and most local governments don't budget money to do a local wetlands inventory. But I believe Corvallis has one. I'm not sure of that, but I think they do. So federal government, let's just go through the three layers. The federal government wetland regulation is done under the Clean Water Act, also known as the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. It's Section 404 of the Clean Water Act that gives the Corps and EPA the authority to do wetlands regulations. It authorizes those two agencies to establish a program to regulate fill activities in WOTUS. That WOTUS stands, and I'm sorry we're getting acronym heavy here. I'm telling you, we're at the 40,000 square foot level, or 40,000 foot level. But WOTUS stands for Waters of the United States. So the federal government has regulation to regulate fill activities in waters of the United States, which includes wetlands. If you're engaged in a fill activity in a water of the United States, you're required to get a permit from the Corps, and that permit is separate and additional from whatever permits you're required to get at both the state and local level. So the question is, what's a water of the United States? And the answer to that is it depends on who is in the White House at the time that question is asked. The definition of waters of the United States have proven difficult. Congress, of course, back in '72 when they did the Clean Water Act amendments, has talked about waters of the United States but never bothered to define them. And so the Corps and EPA have spent the better part of, 28, 30, 47 years going back and forth, depending on who the president is, changing the waters of the United States definition from, and the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court will come in every now and again and kick them upside the head. But the point is, if you have a president that cares about wetlands, the water of the United States might be a mud puddle out here in the parking lot. If you have a president that doesn't really care about waters of the United States, it might be the Mississippi River and the Columbia and a couple of Chesapeake Bay and a couple other things and nothing else. The point is, you should always assume that you're going to be trying to do a fill project in a water of the United States and be pleasantly surprised if the Corps says, well, this isn't the water of the United States, you don't need a permit from us, and then you could have a party and drink beer. So this is interesting, and this is really a unique feature of the Clean Water Act. What about removal activities? Because when we talk about wetlands, we talk about both fill activities where you're putting material into a wetland, but we also talk about removal activities where you're taking things out of a wetland, typically by dredging. So what about removal activities? Does the federal government have authority over removal activities? And the answer to that is probably not. The Clean Water Act certainly doesn't speak to it, and there's been a series of cases over the years, including one where a dredging activity was going on in the water of the United States, and the company doing the dredging said, we don't need a permit from the Corps because we're not filling anything. We're actually removing material from the wetland. We're not putting material in, so we don't need a 404 permit. And the Corps said, well, when you're pulling that material out of the water, some of it is sloughing back out of out and dropping back in, so you actually are doing fill, so you need a permit. And the courts that have considered that issue have said, no, come on, get real. But the point is, what's different about the federal legislation from the local, state and local regulation, state and local regulates both removal and fill. Federal government only regulates fill. So we get to state level, and that's done through DSL, and we've talked about them. They're the agency that approves removal fill permits. You have to submit, if you're doing any wetlands work, you have to submit an application to DSL for a removal fill permit. And we have DLCD, and that's the agency that we've already talked about that implements and monitors land use activities and regulates wetlands through statewide Goal 5. There are 19 statewide land use planning goals. Goal 5 is the one that applies to wetlands, and it applies both inside and outside the urban growth boundary. So now we go to the local government, and we've talked about this as well. Local governments regulate through Goal 5 as part of their land use planning and permitting process. Typically, you won't deal with the local government on a wetlands issue until you go in for some kind of development, some kind of land use application at the local government. And at that point, depending on the type of project that the local government you're dealing with, you may have to address wetlands issues and the property that you have. And then the way that they regulate is that they can prepare the inventory of Goal 5 wetland sites. And as I said earlier, the nice thing about Goal 5 is it gives the local government the ability to allow completely removal fill in wetlands areas or not allow it at all, or partially. They have pretty wide choice on that. John Chandler from the Home Builders, Chandler and I were on the Goal 5 rewrite committee back in the late 90s, I think. And one of the things that we insisted on was that the local governments have that flexibility under Goal 5, and for some unknown reason we got that, and I'm glad we did. Okay, so how do you determine if you have a wetlands? You can look at the National Wetlands Inventory. That's what NWI stands for. There is a federal National Wetlands Inventory, covers the entire United States. It is, for our purposes, in the real estate development, property owner realm, it is essentially worthless. And I don't say that to be mean. They did that. They mapped wetlands at the 40,000 foot level for their national wetland inventory. It's not very specific. There are lots of areas that they didn't map as wetlands that certainly fit the definition of wetlands. And so if you go to the National Wetlands Inventory, if you're selling property and the prospective purchaser says, well, are there wetlands on the property? And you hand them the National Wetlands Inventory and they look and say, well, it doesn't look like it, that's not good enough. Then we've got the statewide wetlands inventory. That's more accurate. That's what DSL is doing now, and that's causing the oh my God in the Willamette Valley, because they're mapping hydric soils, and we're finding a lot of areas that no one ever considered to be wetlands that DSL considers to be wetlands, and that's creating some real friction with the land use planning system. And then we have the local wetland inventory. That's really the most accurate, but as I indicated earlier, there haven't been very many local governments that have completed local wetland inventories. And for development industry purposes, I'd be happy with a bill that says if property isn't in the local wetland inventory, then you can develop it, and it isn't a wetland, but it doesn't work that way. If you're not in the local wetland inventory, most of the local governments still require you to do an individual delineation of your site when you go in and apply for a land use permit, particularly if it's a fairly extensive development. And so they're better, but they really don't solve our problems. And then we have, of course, the individualized delineation. And as I just said, for a large development, most cities are going to require you to go in and do an individualized delineation for the entire site and calculate whether or not you have all or portion of your property in wetlands. So here we go. We're now at the point where I'm ready to do something with my property, and I'm trying to determine whether or not I have a wetland. So I'm going to do an analysis as part of my development application. So the development's proposed. There's nothing indicating that I have a wetland on the National Wetland Inventory, the statewide wetland inventory, the local wetland inventory, so I'm good there. I go down to the city and I say, okay, is there a Goal 5 overlay on my property, a wetland overlay? And the city says no. We don't have that in an overlay, and I put a big few there because if you are in a Goal 5 wetland overlay or a portion of the property, that's probably going to make your application significantly more difficult. So if the answer to that is no, you're not on our wetland inventory, you can be happy about that. So you think, well, I've got it mostly covered. But then the local government comes along and they require the individualized delineation. Or if it's a larger transaction, you've got a sophisticated buyer, which for a larger transaction typically you do, the buyer is going to require a delineation as part of the purchase and sale agreement, and they're going to have due diligence, they're going to have language in their agreement, in the due diligence part of their agreement, that we need a wetlands delineation on this site. Or you as the property owner complete it yourself. But in any event, typically is going to be an individualized delineation done on a larger development anyway. And through that individualized delineation, there are wetlands identified on site. And so all of a sudden your party turned into a bummer, because now you have to go to DSL and say, okay, I need a removal fill permit. And DSL comes out and they look at the site and they do their delineation, and they talk, if you've had a wetlands consultant, they talk with your wetlands consultant, and they delineate the wetland, and then decide essentially what you need to do as far as your removal fill permit. Then you ask, well, okay, is a core permit needed? Do I now need to apply to the federal government for a core permit? And that gets back to the question of, is this a water of the United States? You probably talk to DSL and say, okay, do you think we need a core permit for this? And 9 times out of 10, they're going to tell you, well, probably. And so you're going to apply to the Corps for a permit. Now, DSL's goal, that agency's goal, and this is their legislative charge. They're not, they're not down there trying to stick it to the developer. It's not an anti-development perspective. It's just their legislative charge. Their charge is to preserve wetland functions and values for the positive reasons that wetlands are important that we talked about earlier. So DSL is going to be out there with the eye to preserve functions and values either on that site or on an alternative site through some kind of off-site mitigation. And we'll talk about that. The DSL's hierarchy, when they're doing their work, what they'll do is, okay, let's figure out if we can avoid development in the wetland area. If we can do that, that's our number one goal. Maybe we leave this portion of the property undisturbed, and we go over here and fill and develop this portion of the property that's upland, and then we can avoid. If they can't avoid, then it's minimize. Okay, how can we, maybe if we've got 3 acres of identified wetlands on this site, we'll only need to fill an acre of it and leave the other 2 acres undisturbed. That's a way to minimize the impact on the wetland. And of course, if you can't do either of those, then they'll get to their third level, which is typically where they end up with mitigate. Okay, we're going to fill this wetland area. How are we going to mitigate so that we don't have a loss of wetlands functions and values? Because again, their goal is to preserve wetlands functions and values. And obviously we're going to lose functions and values in this 3-acre site if we take it from a wetland and bring in, a bunch of fill and fill it up. So at that point, you're essentially, you or your wetlands consultant or your lawyer or whoever are negotiating with DSL on the various options. And your options can be avoid the wetland area and develop the uplands, or fill less than 50 cubic yards. There's a 50 cubic yard exemption in state law. You don't need a removal fill permit if you are going to remove or fill less than 50 cubic yards on the site. 50 cubic yards sounds like a lot, but it's basically 3 to 5 dump truck loads, and so it's not very much. And if you've got any kind of development project going, a significant one, that exemption is not going to help you. But if you can avoid it, fine. Minimize, we talked about that. We can reduce the amount of impacted area and the mitigation needed, and then mitigate. And that's typically where you end up, especially in the valley. And by mitigating, we're talking about on-site mitigation. Maybe we move the wetland area, maybe we fill the existing wetland area on this portion of the property, and we go over here and we create some new wetlands over on this portion of the property where the development doesn't fit very well. We can do on-site mitigation. We can do off-site mitigation. Maybe we fill the wetland on this property. We own some adjoining property over here or down the road. We go and enhance the wetlands over on this property over here, so we have no loss of functions and values. Maybe we can do that. We can buy credits at a mitigation bank. There are mitigation banks throughout the valley, not nearly as much as we need, but there are mitigation banks that have been established. You may be able to say, okay, I'm going to fill 3 acres of wetland on this site, and DSL will say, okay, then you need to go buy 3 acres or 5 acres or 6 acres of mitigation credits from the mitigation bank, and you go do that. The problem with mitigation banking is because it's basically hard to create a mitigation bank, and we need a lot of them. They're usually created out in the rural areas on farmland. The DLCD doesn't like that very well. It's hard to get conventional financing for a mitigation bank. You go to the US Bank or Wells Fargo or what, I'm not picking on any individual banks. You just go to a regular bank and you say, hey, I want to borrow $2 million and I'm going to go out there and I'm going to create a bunch of wetlands. And the bank says, well, how are you going to pay your loan? Well, when somebody comes and develops on wetlands, then I'm going to sell them wetlands mitigation credits and pay you back. Well, when's that going to happen? Well, I don't know. It depends on the market. And I'm not even sure I can get a permit because I have to get a mitigation bank. I have to satisfy federal law, federal rules, state law, state rules. Don't have much in the way of local. So, but can you give me the money anyway? And the bank typically looks at that and no. And so it's hard to get, despite the fact that we desperately need mitigation banks, they're hard to get. Hence, their credits for the ones that we have are extremely expensive. And so you kill a lot of projects when, and again, we'll get to this in our Sheridan example, you kill a lot of projects when you have to buy mitigation bank credits. And then the last thing we have, if everything else fails, the DSL will sometimes allow a payment in lieu of any of on-site, off-site, or mitigation bank credits. They'll allow payment in lieu of that, but it's not available if the other options are possible. So it doesn't happen very often. Yeah?
In fact, the 3 to 5 on Phil,
Yeah.
is that per a particular size property? Like, is that per acre, or is it no matter what the size?
No matter what the size of the property is. Okay, so yeah, Debbie. Yeah, so the question is, does DSL, if a local government is doing a local wetland inventory or some kind of Goal 5 planning, is DSL invited in and do they comment on those processes? And the answer to both of those is absolutely. On the local wetland inventory, you're working, the local government is working directly with DSL on the local wetland inventory. On the Goal 5 wetland overlay, the local government is working through DLCD, but DLCD is also consulting with the Corps, or excuse me, with DSL on what the city is trying to map, and are they doing enough? Because as you know, on land use planning, when the local government plans under Goal 5 or under any of the goals, and they adopt changes to their comprehensive plan or the zoning ordinance, those have to go to the state, to DLCD, for acknowledgement and approval. And so the answer is yes, you have DSL working at both ways.
But the problem is that they get a second bite at it through the permitting process.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the problem is through the individualized delineations, essentially you get a second bite at the apple. Or in some cases, you get a third bite at the apple. We represented and passed a bill in the 17 session for a farmer down in Junction City who built a series of ag buildings on his property, had a hay press in one of them. The building burnt down. The Lane County issued the approval, said there's no wetlands on here. It's not on the state wetlands inventory. It's not on the national wetlands inventory. We don't have a local wetland inventory, and it's not on our Goal 5 list. So they approved a permit. He went out and built the buildings. One of them burnt down. He went back to rebuild his burnt down building. And at that point, the neighbor called who didn't like what the ag activities that were going on the property. The neighbor called DSL and said, I think he's working in a wetland. And DSL came out and said, yes, this is hydric soils. We think this is a wetland. And all he was trying to do was basically put the building that burnt down back up. And we had to pass a bill for him. Guy's name is Jesse Bounds. We had to pass a bill for Jesse so that he could put his building back up. So there you go. So current, and that'll lead us into our current and developing issues. As I indicated earlier, we've got a conflict between preserving functions and values, DSL's mission, and Goal 14, compact development inside the urban growth boundaries, DLCD's mission, and most local governments' missions. I'll give you an example. We'll talk about our Sheridan dilemma. So I've got this guy in Sheridan who's got 10 acres. His property is inside the urban growth boundary. It's inside the Sheridan city limits, zoned for multifamily development. The city of Sheridan and the state of Oregon, through their economic development agency, spent years and millions of dollars trying to find someone to come in and occupy the former site for a trailer parts manufacturer in the city of Sheridan. Sheridan had a company that was in there that was employing people at family wage jobs manufacturing parts for travel trailers. That company went out of business, left. The buildings were essentially vacant and abandoned, and nobody was interested in buying them. So Sheridan, which is, as you know, I assume most of you know where Sheridan is. It's the main thing in Sheridan is the federal prison, but Sheridan is a struggling small town, dwarfed by McMinnville, which is a few miles, I guess, to the east, and really had fallen on hard times. And so the state of Oregon and the city of Sheridan spent years and millions of dollars finding someone to come in to occupy this old abandoned trailer parts manufacturing warehouses, and they found a company called Forest River Inc., which is a Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett company. They manufacture parts for trailer houses, so it worked out swell. They replaced one trailer part manufacturer with another trailer part manufacturer, 300 employees, average wage about $45,000 a year. So that you're not getting rich working there, but you're doing better than you would working the graveyard at the Plaid Pantry or Dairy Mart or wherever. So that's fine. Our guy with his 10 acres, right up next to a subdivision, a stick-built subdivision that he developed in about 10 years previously. The owner of the property is a sophisticated developer. He's worked through multiple jurisdictions. He goes to the city of Sheridan, and Sheridan says, yeah, we would love that. What he is proposing is a manufactured home park, which are citing new manufactured home parks in Oregon is very rare, but he thinks he can make the project pencil. And basically, it'll pencil for people with incomes between $35,000 and up. The average wage at the Forest River trailer parts manufacturer is about $45,000. So he's basically building workforce housing for the people that are working there. They can't afford to buy a house in McMinnville because it's too expensive. There's no available inventory in Sheridan. And so he's basically filling a niche. And he goes to Sheridan and pitches Sheridan, and Sheridan says, yeah, we love this. What can we do to help you? Okay, well, everything's a go. We've got a friendly local jurisdiction. We dot all the I's and cross all the T's with the local government land use planning stuff. DLCD's fine with it. State loves it. DSL comes in because Sheridan says, well, you probably need an individualized delineation. So he goes out and he hires a wetlands consultant. The wetlands consultant says, on your 11 acres, actually 11 acres, on your 11-acre parcel, 9 out of your 11 acres are composed of hydric soils, and therefore we at least need to talk to DSL. Oh, great. All right, so DSL comes out. And this land, just so you know, this land is cropland. It's in the city, it's in Sheridan, it's in the boundary. It's available for development, but it's been, prior to as Sheridan grew, it hasn't gone out there yet. So it's been farmed. It's been farmed for probably 100 years. whatever wetland was there ain't there anymore, and you don't have ducks and geese and frogs and things out there. It's not like those pictures we looked at. But anyway, DSL sends their person out, and then their person goes out and says, yeah, we think this is a wetland, and they delineate 9 out of the 11 acres as a wetland. So my developer guy says, okay, well, what do I have to do now? And DSL says, well, you can buy mitigation credits. All right, well, where do I buy these mitigation credits? You can buy them at the Mud Slough Mitigation Bank. Mitigation banks serve watersheds. And so this watershed, the only mitigation bank in this watershed, which also serves McMinnville, is the Mud Slough Mitigation Bank. So our guy calls the owner of the Mud Slough Mitigation Bank and says, okay, I need to buy mitigation credits, 9 acres worth of mitigation credits. How much are they? And the guy says they're $75,000 an acre. And so when he goes to buy his mitigation credits, he's into the $700,000 worth of mitigation credits. And at that point, the project was on a razor-thin margin anyway. At that point, the project doesn't pencil out. So you get no affordable workforce housing in Sheridan. The work that the state did to bring that company there, they find employees that don't have a place to live, they can't afford rent, they can't afford to buy in McMinnville. And the mitigation banker, and I don't blame the mitigation banker is selling the credits for what they're worth. And if I'm building $450,000 housing in McMinnville, I might be able to make a project pencil with a $75,000 mitigation credit. If I'm building housing for people with incomes between $35,000 and above, I ain't going to make the project pencil. And so basically, DSL killed the project. And I have spent the better part of 2 years at the Capitol saying, okay, what are we going to do about this? Because this isn't, I've worked with Pat Hare, who's the city manager here in Adair Village, Brian Latta from Harrisburg. This is a big problem for the small Willamette Valley cities. It's a big problem. And unfortunately, to date, now maybe lightning will strike, but right now we don't have a real good answer for that. Then we have the Citizens for Responsible Development in the Dows versus Walmart. If you ever want to agitate the neighbors, go in and apply for a Walmart. So the good folk in the Dows found out that there was going to be a Walmart, and that pissed them off. And so they mobilized to kill the Walmart. My dad, by the way, my dad is dead, and he was a great guy. I loved him. He's a really neat guy. He just hated Walmart for some reason, and I don't know why. He grew up in Merrill and then lived in Columbia County for 50 years, and so Walmart's the sort of the perfect thing for him. Anyway, he would just rail about Walmart, and then we lived in St. Helens. Then they built a Walmart in St. Helens, and I came out to the house one day, and he had a brand new TV. I said, hey, where'd you get your TV? Walmart. Yeah, all right, buddy. Well, anyway, the Court of Appeals, the Oregon Court of Appeals, held that DSL can't issue a fill permit. They cannot issue one unless they make a finding that the public need for the project predominates over the loss of state waters, even with mitigation. So if you're going to fill that wetland, the DSL has to find that there's the public need to fill that wetland predominates over the loss of state waters. And of course, Walmart said, well, sure it predominates because we're coming into the Dows and providing products at a low price that the public wants. Obviously, we wouldn't be building a store where we weren't going to sell a lot of products to the local citizenry. And the Court of Appeals said, well, we don't think that's good enough. And so this case, fortunately, is on appeal to the Oregon Supreme Court, and the Supremes have taken it. But if this ruling stands, it's going to be very difficult for development projects to receive removal fill permits from DSL, even if DSL would want to issue them, even if DSL would say, well, you can fill here and we can do offsite or on-site mitigation that'll solve the problem and actually enhance functions and values, they still won't be able to approve this. We have a bill that we're working in the 2020 short session in February that will override this case. I'm hoping the Supreme Court will do our work for us, but we'll see. We have the impact on affordable workforce housing that we talked about. We have the lack of mitigation banks that we talked about. And now finally we have some DSL overreach. And this is not typical of this agency. I like the folks at DSL, they're good people. But they've increasingly started to overreach. And the example for this is out of Philomath. We have a developer in Philomath that's that's applied for office construction. Some of you might be familiar with this project. I don't remember where it is. It's about, again, another about 10-acre site. And part of it's wetlands, identified wetlands, and so they went to DSL and said, okay, what do we need to do? And DSL said, you've got an application to fill about 2 acres of the wetlands. You can do offsite, you can buy credits from the mitigation bank. The folks went down, the developer went down, he bought the mitigation credits, came back to DSL saying, okay, I bought the mitigation credits, and DSL issued a letter saying, okay, you've satisfied your requirements in order to receive your permit. Then they issued the permit itself, and on the permit itself, it said, you have satisfied the requirements for this, but oh, by the way, it looks like you're only going to develop about 4 acres of your 10 acres. We want a permanent conservation easement on 5 acres on the rest of the site, saying that you will never develop that site for anything. And the developer says, what the hell? I bought the mitigation credits, which you said in your letter were sufficient to preserve functions and values. Where do you have the authority to do this? And DSL's response is, we have the authority because we have the authority. And so that case, that is working its way through the system now as well. If that becomes prevalent, then we're going to have even more difficulty developing property. And developing property in Oregon is hard enough as it is. We can't make it worse. So what are we doing about this at the legislature? And then I'm done. The caveat here is there's only so much the Oregon legislature can do, because remember, we have a federal layer and a local layer. The Oregon legislature can't deal with federal law, and good luck getting Congress to do anything, much less amend the Clean Water Act. There's no joy in them from doing something that makes imminent sense, but won't score brownie points at home. We last session passed House Bill 2436, which is a partial assumption bill. The goal of this bill is for development inside the urban growth boundary and mining activities. We are going to get the state to assume jurisdiction from the Corps. The Clean Water Act has language in it that says the states can come in if they can show that they can do as good a job as the federal government, as the federal agencies. They can come in and assume our jurisdiction and essentially issue federal permits under the Clean Water Act. But only 2 states have done that, because most states don't have the staffing to do that. And in previous administrations, up until the current one, in previous administrations, they haven't encouraged the agency to work with the states to assume jurisdiction. The current administration has no trouble telling the Corps and EPA, why don't you go find better things to do? And so all of a sudden the Corps and EPA have approached the states and said, hey, would you like to assume jurisdiction over wetlands permitting under the Clean Water Act? The states have said no. universally have said, no, we don't have the staffing, but a number of states have said, well, what about if we assume just part of your duties and you keep the other part? We're exploring that in Oregon, and we passed a bill last session that gives DSL the authority to do partial assumption over wetlands permits under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act for development inside the urban growth boundaries and all mining activities. Those are the two industries. Mine on behalf of both the mining industry and the development industry really want that, because now if we can get this through and we can get the Corps and EPA to grant DSL partial assumption, we only need to get one permit instead of two. So if I go in to develop a project, 240 lot subdivision in Beaverton, I need a permit from the DSL, but I don't need a permit from the Corps. And that's really important because they operate on different time tracks, there's different procedures, and you may get the Corps to say okay and DSL to say no, or you might get DSL to say okay and the Corps to say no. If we can eliminate that, that's great. So we're working on that right now, and that's a cool bill. It hasn't happened yet, but we're starting the process. They passed an ag ditch bill last session, House Bill 2437, to help farmers maintain their ag ditches and really increase the amount of activity that the farmer can have maintaining their ag ditches without a permit over what we previously had. We failed on House Bill 2796, which is a Sheridan fix, basically designed to say, okay, if I'm working in degraded wetlands and I'm building affordable housing or workforce housing, I only need to fill at a 1-to-4 ratio. In other words, if I'm impacting 4 acres of wetlands, I only need to buy 1 acre of mitigation credits. That bill failed. It was an attempt to solve that issue. Something like that will come back. And then overriding the Dows case that we talked about, we're working on that in 2020. So that's it. I'm sorry to take so much time, but again, if you really want to get into wetlands, I'm happy to answer any questions, and we can spend a lot of time doing it. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. I don't know when the consultants go out and do their soil sampling. I don't know how far they dig, but the definition of hydric soils talks about it at the top layers of the soil. And like I say, you can have hydric soils that result because the soils are clayey, and so the water pools from the top, or you can have hydric soils that come from the groundwater because you've got a groundwater table that's pretty close to the surface. How far they dig, I don't know. Yeah, the question was, when you have to buy mitigation credits, can you shop around, or does DSL tell you where you have to go? If you're within, you have to buy credits from the bank that's within the watershed where your development project is. And so I can't go, from my Sheridan guy can't go down to Jackson County and buy credits at the Jackson County, at the bank that serves that watershed. And the price of those vary significantly depending on how many there are and depending on the development activity that's going on in that particular area. If there's more than one mitigation bank. The ones closer into Portland, the mud slough was selling for $75,000 an acre or thereabouts. The ones closer to Portland, I think Beaverton School District paid almost $200,000 an acre for their mitigation credits at the bank out there in Washington County. So they're expensive. They are project killers. What? How many mitigation banks are there? We had a banker come in and I'm on a number of DSL work groups, but we had one where we were talking about, okay, how do we encourage mitigation banking? And we had someone come in and give us that answer, and it wasn't very many. But in most watersheds, there's typically only one mitigation bank. And so there's more than that around the Portland metropolitan area, but there's a lot more development in the Portland metropolitan area, and the development is higher end development, more expensive, and so they could charge more, and they are. But typically we need massive increased numbers of mitigation banks to serve all of the proposed development. No, you have to buy credits from the mitigation bank that serves the watershed where you're developing. Yeah, yeah. And one of the things that we've talked about is figuring out how to get federal and state funding for mitigation bank purchases. Because, like I say, it's hard to convince a commercial bank to lend on a project like that that's so uncertain as to how you're going to essentially make money from it. Yeah, Don. Yeah, so the question is, if there's a wetlands delineation made on the property that essentially devalues the property completely, why is that not considered a taking? And the answer to that would be, you might have a Measure 49 claim, and we've told DSL that, at some point, if you go out and delineate and decide that an area is a wetland and make the credit, either you can't find the credits or there's no way to mitigate, and you reduce the value of that property, you're looking at Measure 49 claims, which they understand. And which is sort of the downside of the statewide wetlands inventory mapping that they're doing. So it's a claim that's going to be brought, Don. It hasn't been brought yet, but it's a claim that's going to be brought. And in fact, it may be brought in this Willamette case that we have that I was talking about earlier. The other problem that it creates, and Lebanon isn't unique, it's like most of the valley cities, their buildable lands inventories were done in the 80s, mid 80s, early 90s maybe. And as we get growth pressure, those buildable land inventories we need boundary expansions in some of those cities. And as we go to do boundary expansions, what we're finding is that a number of those cities, it's hard enough to expand an urban growth boundary under Goal 14 anyway without wetlands issues, but what we're finding is that most of the land surrounding these cities is composed of hydric soils. And so it's tough because you can't cherry stem your boundary expansion, 15 miles till you find a hill that's all upland, and it doesn't make any planning sense to do that. And so you have, again, the conflict between what our land use planning system tells us we're supposed to do and what DSL wants us to do. And that's the conflict that the legislature is struggling with right now, that we're all struggling with right now. The question is, if you have a large parcel that's wetlands, how do you go about qualifying it as a mitigation bank? Really what both the feds and the state are looking for at mitigation bank is taking land that isn't wetland and creating new wetland out of it. If your land is already wetland, it's not a good site for a mitigation bank. You might be able to do some work to enhance the wetlands on there. But really what they're looking for in creating new mitigation banks is taking land that's not a wetland right now, or that was formerly a wetland, might have hydric soils, but has been farmed or whatever to the point where, yeah, technically it's a wetland, but you could really enhance it, and converting those areas into mitigation banks. And the way you do that, as our mitigation banker told our work group about a year ago, it is a extremely complicated process that requires consultation with the Corps and DSL. There are state regulations and federal regulations that you have to satisfy in order to get approval. And it's very uncertain. And so hence one of the reasons why we need to really explore, and why Congress needs to, but they won't, why Congress needs to explore how we can make mitigation banks easier to cite and create so that we have some competition and some lower prices so we can develop property. It's the same watershed. It's not, the question is, if I have to buy credits, do I have to buy them in the same county? And the answer to that is no, it's in the same watershed. And DSL will have if you go to DSL and say, here's the property I'm developing, they'll tell you which watershed it is and if there's a mitigation bank, where it is, and give you the contact info for that. The watersheds tend to be larger than an individual county. I suppose if we had wetlands out in Harney County, then that may not be the case, but you know, this is mainly a west side valley issue. Yeah, the question is there a difference between constrained land and wetlands for purposes of a buildable lands inventory? And the answer to that is yes. The constrained land definition is probably broader because there are a number of different factors that can result in that designation as opposed to just wetlands. It might be wetland, but it might be other things as well. Okay, thank you very much.